Welcome back to our broadcast, Exploring Implicit Bias in the History Social Science Classroom. I'm Michelle Herzog. I'm the History Social Science Coordinator 3 for the LA County Office of Education, and we're here with Module 2, Developing Mindsets, Skill Sets, and Exploring Bias. Right now, we are going into Part 4 of this module, Navigating Difficult Conversations about Ethnic Studies with Adults or the Community. If you've been with us up till now, Part 1 of the module was an overview of developing positive mindsets. Part 2 was on developing skill sets in classrooms. And Part 3 that we just finished is around helping students address difficult conversations. Now we're at Part 4, so sometimes this is the most challenging. And how do we navigate those difficult conversations with each other, with our colleagues in the workforce, with adults we know, with family members, with members of the community? This is really comes close to home for many of us, right? Can we have peace around the Thanksgiving table, for one thing, for one example? So I want to re-invite and thank again Sandy Line, my good friend and colleague, for joining me. She has extensive experience as a classroom teacher, teacher leader, mentor, works with student teachers, and a wonderful presenter for many trainings we've done here at LACO. Thank you, Sandy, again for all your prep for this work.
Thank you,
and
Michelle.
for being here today.
Thank you. And you're right. Conversations with adults, oh my gosh, it's like navigating a minefield.
It can be.
And in the last couple of years, it's become even more difficult. So what we need to do is we need to talk about how do we have these difficult conversations with adults, and how can we diffuse some of the emotion around it, knowing that everybody comes from a different perspective, that they're bringing all of their life experience to the table when they have these conversations, and they certainly have very strong opinions. As educators, we know our colleagues have strong opinions. So what we're going to talk about is why are conversations with adults, our colleagues, and community members difficult? Why don't they think the way I think? What's the problem
I
there?
don't know why.
And what are some of the ways to deal with these difficult conversations? First of all, we have to look at implicit bias. We've already talked about implicit bias when we talked about microaggressions. But implicit bias is bias that you have that you don't even realize that you have. It just comes with you. And as Michelle mentioned, this is something, if you have a brain, you have a bias. And usually that implicit bias has been taught to you, or you have thought about it, or it's been inculcated into your personality when you were very young. Symbols or situations that you saw that you developed this particular bias. You may not even be aware of it till it comes out later in life. So what we need to do is we need to ask teachers to address their own biases. And this is critical for ethnic studies teachers, because we come into the classroom as an ethnic studies teacher and we bring all of our stuff with us, just as our kids do, just as people in the community do. But if we don't recognize the stuff that we bring in, it can cause all sorts of difficulties. Perhaps even some conflicts within the classroom. So the first thing we have to do is we have to find a way to find out what we're biased about. And one of the best ways, and this is really kind of a fun thing to do, is the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. This test will give you an idea of where you stand on various issues. You do not have to report the scores, even though Harvard would like you to share your scores with them. You don't need to do that, but you can find out where you stand on various issues. And some of these issues are race, gender, age, disability, weapons. Isn't that an interesting topic? And presidents. This is what the scores will look like when you're finished, and it will show you where you stand on particular topics. They ask you various questions. They're very simple to answer, but for whatever algorithm Harvard uses, they identify some of your biases. The things that I found very interesting about this is weapons.
Yes.
I'm originally from the Midwest. People do a lot of deer hunting and pheasant hunting in the Midwest. And so they have guns. They have shotguns and rifles and so forth because that's part of the culture. If you go to another area of the country, you may get no comment about weapons because that's not something that they've been involved with. But this is a really interesting thing to do. And I would suggest anybody who has the opportunity to take these tests just to get an idea of where you stand and what your bias is.
And they can find the link to that in the guide,
Absolutely.
right? That comes with
Yes.
this broadcast.
And it's
And it's free
It's absolutely free.
and private.
Absolutely.
So you can just get your results
Right.
back,
Harvard would love to
read
know
them,
how you
shred them,
responded.
share them,
Yes,
not share them.
Absolutely. It's very interesting where you stand. Probably most of us are right in the middle. But on some things, we might be very skewed. And that's something to not be ashamed of, just to be aware of, because that may influence some of the things that you say or do in your classroom. Forewarned is forearmed. So if you know what your bias is, then you can be sure that you know how to address it.
Well, and it may not change your bias, but just recognizing it.
Recognizing it is really important.
Great first
You
step.
know, so many people will say, well, I'm not a racist. Well, okay, you're not a racist, but you may have a predisposition in certain areas about race. And so it's good to know those kinds of things. So anyway, have an opportunity to take this test.
I've tried it. It's very revealing.
It's very revealing.
Yes. So I know we've heard about this test also from Dr. Bryant T. Marks. He has spoken here at LACO many, many times on implicit bias. And like you said, he always says, if you live in a society and you have a brain, you're going to have bias. And it's not something you choose. It's just based on what your environment and what is input into you in your world, and what to be aware of that. And just the importance of recognizing it, as you say, as we interact with other people.
Absolutely. And that's the important thing of identifying your bias.
And he talks about one of the biggest areas of discrimination, which surprised me, is around ageism, which is interesting too. So yeah, a lot of that can be revealed.
Well, and think about, that's a really interesting comment, Michelle, because think about how our society perhaps does not value our older people. But if you go to Japan, Japanese elders are revered because of their knowledge and their experience. That's a cultural difference. And so that's something that you would be really interesting to look at, especially through the lens of ethnic studies. How do other cultures treat their old people? You know, there's a group of indigenous folks in Alaska where the older people, when they're close to death, it used to be they would go out onto like an ice floe and just float away and die because it was their time. And that was how the elders were treated. And nobody thought anything that it was wrong. It was just their time. But that is certainly, if you were to say to me, well, find an ice floe and float away, I would say, no, I'm not doing that one, because that's not my cultural background. So identifying a bias is really an important thing to know about.
There's some people who might opt for something like that.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a very personal kind of decision.
Very definitely.
Yeah.
And it has to do with your culture and your background.
Well, yeah, to some extent, sure.
Some of the things that can lead to a difficult conversation. Is it a microaggression? If I say something to you and it is a microaggression that I'm not aware of, and you respond in a more aggressive manner or a manner that's hurt or resentful, that can cause a difficult conversation or a conflict between colleagues or adults because of the misunderstanding. And some of the examples would be using he to refer to all people. You know, the generic he, the way it used to be in all of our literature that all people referred to as he, or being the comment, well, we're only women, we can't do that. That's not something you want to say in 2024.
No.
And then being forced to identify if you are just male or female, not recognizing other dimensions. And then two options for relationships, like are you married or single? Well, there are other situations also. But those are forms of microaggression because they don't take into account other groups or other people.
Yeah.
So one of the things, if it's a microaggression, just as we talk about students dealing with microaggressions, we want to say, I heard you saying, can you tell me more about that? putting it back on the person who said that and asking them to define or defend what they've just said. It may cause them to stop and rethink what they've said. So we want to teach our students to use that same technique. I don't understand why you're saying this. Or could you say more about what you just said? I don't really understand it. How did you come to think that? You're not attacking what they said. You're just asking for more
So
information.
using that with adults each other as
Absolutely.
a sentence frame.
Absolutely.
It'd be hard to get used to that, but I
It
could see how
is.
it's useful.
But it's,
Because
you
it's
know,
so easy just to let it go and
if somebody were to say something that was really antagonistic to you, let's say it's a political statement, rather than saying, well, you're just an idiot, don't say those things, you might say, well, how did you come to think that way? Or why do you think that way?
help me understand
Yes,
that point of view.
exactly. Those are very benign comments to kind of diffuse the temperature of those kinds of statements. And that's critical with another adult.
Yes.
And what makes difficult conversations difficult? Well, it's because of what we bring to our fellow adults, our own situation. And we're going to see a really interesting video by Melody Hobson, who is the founder of Ariel Investments. You may know her because she is George Lucas's wife.
Oh.
And she is a Black woman who talks about being colorblind or color brave. And remember we said one of the things that's a microaggression is I don't see color.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Well, she wants to say, yes, you do, and let's recognize it.
Okay, good.
I have succeeded in my life beyond my wildest expectations. And I've been treated well by people of all races more often than I have not. I tell the uniform story because it happened. I cite those statistics around corporate board diversity because they are real. And I stand here today talking about this issue of racial discrimination because I believe it threatens to rob another generation of all the opportunities that all of us want for all of our children, no matter what their color or where they come from. And I think it also threatens to hold back businesses. You see, researchers have coined this term color blindness to describe a learned behavior where we pretend that we don't notice race. If you happen to be surrounded by a bunch of people who look like you, that's purely accidental. Now, color blindness, in my view, doesn't mean that there's no racial discrimination and there's fairness. It doesn't mean that at all. It doesn't ensure it. In my view, color blindness is very dangerous because it means we're ignoring the problem. There was a corporate study that said that instead of avoiding race, the really smart corporations actually deal with it head on. They actually recognize that embracing diversity means recognizing all races, including the majority one. But I'll be the first one to tell you, this subject matter can be hard, awkward, uncomfortable, but that's kind of the point. In the spirit of debunking racial stereotypes, the one that Black people don't like to swim, I'm going to tell you how much I love to swim. I love to swim so much that as an adult, I swim with a coach. And one day my coach had me do a drill where I had to swim to one end of a 25-meter pool without taking a breath. And every single time I failed, I had to start over. And I failed a lot. By the end, I got it, but I got out of the pool, I was exasperated and tired and annoyed. And I said, why are we doing breath-holding exercises? And my coach looked at me and he said, Melody, that was not a breath-holding exercise. That drill was to make you comfortable being uncomfortable, because that's how most of us spend our days. If we can learn to deal with our discomfort and just relax into it, we'll have a better life. So I think it's time for us to be comfortable with the uncomfortable conversation about race. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, male, female, all of us. If we truly believe in equal rights and equal opportunity in America, I think we have to have real conversations about this issue. We cannot afford to be colorblind. We have to be color brave. We have to be willing, as teachers and parents and entrepreneurs and scientists, we have to be willing to have proactive conversations about race with honesty and understanding and courage. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the smart thing to do. Thank you.
This is only a portion of the video. When you have the opportunity to see the whole video, you will find out more about Melody's background and so forth. But I think the thing that is so important about this video is that she said we need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable about certain topics. And many of that topic is basically race. And we need to lean into it rather than ignoring that it exists.
I think that'll be easier for some people than others.
Absolutely.
So might take some
Absolutely.
adjusting.
It definitely does. But she talks about the importance of diversity and having a diverse group of people with you at all times because of the different perspectives that they bring and how important those perspectives are in broadening your perception of a particular situation. So I think it's a valuable tool, not only for adults, but also for parents, for community members to think about what do we mean by ethnic
Be
studies.
a good thing to show at a staff meeting and have a discussion about.
I think it would be an excellent thing.
Yes.
Because it talks about how people with different perspectives are so important. She talked about smallpox, which is a really interesting portion of this video, and that scientists were trying to figure out where does smallpox come from, what's going on, and lo and behold, they found out that milkmaids never got smallpox, because smallpox vaccine is based on a bovine product. So they were totally immune to smallpox because they were around the cows and milk, and I don't understand the science part of it.
Were they drinking milk?
No, they were
Just around it?
around it, milking the cows and so forth. And this was the genesis for developing the smallpox
Interesting.
vaccine. But had they not expanded their view
Yeah.
to this group of people, they never would have been able
Yes.
to develop
Very
that particular vaccine, which I find amazing. And so just think of all of the things that people have to offer that we haven't tapped into yet.
Yes.
That's important. Some of the difficult ingredients of conversations with adults is differing perceptions. We all see something, and your perception may be different than my perception. That's why law enforcement say eyewitnesses are no use at all, because they don't really see the whole picture. You can ask witnesses what they saw, and one person had a black hat on, same person had a blue hat on. You come with a different perception. So it doesn't mean my perception is correct or yours is correct, so we need to be aware of that. Then we have to think about intent. What is the intent of the other person in this conversation? Are they trying to convince me of something? Are they trying to sway my vote? All of those things. What is the intent of the conversation? Then what are the feelings involved? Feelings are so critical, not only for students, but for adults. And for adults who have very strong feelings on particular topics, those conversations become extraordinarily emotional. And so we have to be aware of that. And then blame. Are we blaming the other person for what they're saying? Are you saying something and this is ridiculous and I'm blaming you for that? So we have to think about those things. So those are some of the factors of a difficult conversation. So what do we do?
Yes.
This is tough. First of all, we have to put aside our preconceptions. Basically, what we want to do is we want to approach another adult or colleague with the idea is, you have good intentions. I want to understand. I don't go into a conversation with you thinking she has no idea what she's talking about. I have to listen. Then I have to approach you with respect because I value your opinion. I value you as a person and a colleague. Then I have to examine my own motivation. What is my reason for getting into this conversation? Is this a conversation I really want to be a part of? Or is this something that is really not something that I need to be involved with? I don't need to be in somebody else's fight. So if you're having a problem with another person, my motivation is not to get into this conversation because it has nothing to do with me. Then you need to embrace the discomfort of not knowing. I don't know what you know. You could know so much more about a topic than I do, and I don't know that yet. Then I have to find out what I don't know. So there would be questions about, well, what did you see? How did you feel? What's your evidence? Those kinds of things, so I can add to my knowledge. And I need to listen and be open to questions. This is the critical part again. It's the idea that you listen to learn and not just listen to respond. So many of us, when we're having conversations, we've already tuned the other person out because we're thinking of the answer we're going to give. So we miss the real meat of their conversation. So that becomes a big issue. Now, what about community members? Some of your community members may have very strong feelings about ethnic studies. For example, you may run into a community who says, why are we studying about these different ethnic groups? Why aren't we just studying about the groups that are at this particular school? And so you need to identify what's going on here. So you want to prepare your key message. So going into a conversation with a community member, you really have to have your ducks in a row.
Right.
So this is, what is your message? What do you want to convey to the community? You also need to prepare what you're going to say, especially in dealing with the community. This is not off the top of your head. We see very often people in public life who open their mouths and say things that they have to backtrack later. That gives the idea that you're not really knowing what you're talking about and becomes an area for extreme criticism. So you need to prepare what you're going to say so you're not going to be surprised if you get a question that you hadn't anticipated. Start from the ending. What do you want to achieve? If it's about ethnic studies, I want the community to know how this is going to benefit their students by knowing about different ethnicities so everyone can work together and we can diffuse situations that could become difficult. You have to use a non-blaming communication style. Well, it's your fault that your child is like this. That doesn't ever work. You can't blame somebody for that. So you have to pull that out of your conversation. Active listening, once again, you're listening to learn, not just to respond.
Yes.
And if it gets heated, which it often can, then you take a break. And it's basically, can we revisit this at another time? Or I need to just kind of sit down and think about the things that you're saying so I have a better understanding. Those are easy things to say that are going to kind of diffuse a volatile situation, but also help you gather your thoughts when you come back to have a conversation. So those are some of the things to think about.
So I found too, because I've been in some of those situations where you have very strong differing opinions, trying to find some common ground. Something like, what is our common purpose? We want all our young people to succeed. We want them to feel safe. We want them to feel valued. I think that's something other groups from all other different perspectives can agree upon. If we can start there and then from there start to peel it away, well, what feels safe to some may feel safe different from others, and kind of going that way, finding common ground.
Oh, that's such an important point, because if you can find a point on which you both sides can agree,
Yes.
you can move forward from
Yes.
that. And frequently it is just plumbing the conversation for that commonality. And, talking about we want the best for our children. No one can argue that one. No one can say, no, I don't want the best for my kid. But that is the starting point. And
agree.
Here is ethnic studies. This is going to provide good for your children because they're going to be able to deal with other people of different ethnicities and get along and understand that we share so many things in common.
So what can administrators do to help folks at their school sites? What are some
First
things
of all, they can
do?
do some professional development.
Yes, always key.
And this is really an important factor. There are people who can come into your school to talk about inherent bias, sometimes coming from an administrator. Teachers tune that administrator out. But if you have an expert come in on implicit bias who can talk about these things and these factors in a very non-judgmental way, this helps open the mind of people. The onus is on the administration, though, to prepare the faculty or the teacher group that you're going to talk about as to what is the purpose of this conversation and what this conversation can lead to. how it can help you in your classroom and can help you with your colleague.
Creating that safe space too.
Absolutely.
For the adults that you're working with.
Absolutely, that is true. Also, professional learning communities are very good. Many of our schools have professional learning communities where people read the same books and have conversations about them in a very safe place where they can talk about some of the ideas that are raised. Professional learning communities are really valuable, but it's important for the administration, the teachers involved, to be willing to be open to these things.
Yes.
You can't just say, I'll wait them out because this will go away. We don't want it to go away. We want our young people to benefit. And so the way that they will benefit is if we are open to these new ideas. Some of the things that you can do yourself is when you hear a joke that is off color or biased, call it out. This is not okay. I'm not comfortable with what you're saying, so that this kind of toxic environment does not grow. And frequently you will find there are certain cultures in schools where this is the way it's always been. So it's hard to break the pattern. And if you're new to a school, it's really hard to break the pattern.
Yes,
and
it is.
as a teacher, especially a new teacher, it's very hard to challenge a veteran teacher about what they have said or done. But it's something that if you just say, no, I'm not comfortable with this kind of discussion, and make it clear, that will help perhaps tone down an atmosphere that is not comfortable for you. That's something to think about. And talk about words hurt. I have a friend who says, words are like bullets. You can't take them back.
Oof.
And that is really kind of a very powerful statement, because sometimes things comes out of our mouths that we don't want to come out of our mouths. And if we thought first, we would never have said it.
Yes.
And so you need to be careful with your words. I'm not saying you have to be politically correct, but you need to know what you're saying is not going to be harmful or degrading to anyone. Using the I statement. You're not putting it on the other person. You're saying, I'm just not comfortable with this. Or I don't want to hear this again.
We used to use this with students.
Yes.
I feel blank when you blank because.
Yes.
Yes. I use that on my own children.
Right. And you don't want to say, you shouldn't say that.
No.
Because then the person becomes defensive.
Right.
So you just say, I'm not really comfortable hearing this.
Yeah, it'd be nice to bring those back again.
Yes, it is, because it puts it totally on you, and the other person doesn't need to feel defensive about it. You can also say, I know you probably don't mean anything by it, but I find it hard to listen to anti-gay jokes, and especially in our climate today, where we have a lot of people who are feeling a discrimination. We want to make them feel safe, and so we don't want anti-gay jokes in our schools or in our classrooms or our meetings. So those kinds of comments are a type of intervention that are really very easy, but it's not just the only way. We just don't depend on just I statements. We need to talk about ways that we can make meaningful change. And that frequently is through professional development
And it takes practice.
It does.
Sometimes this is not something we're used to. It takes time. We have to give ourselves some grace.
Right. And this is the other thing with the Melody Hobson video. Being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that is the thing, is that this is not, you don't want it, you want everybody to like you. So I'm not going to say something that might be offensive. But on the other hand, what are you giving up of yourself when you don't challenge a comment that is offensive? So that's something to think about.
It's hard. It's hard.
So ideally, in a community with other educators, teachers gain insight from their experiences and their perspectives, and they can build relationships with ongoing exploration, identifying their bias and so forth, which may then be useful as they can create reflective communities with their students also and with their colleagues. Ethnic studies are enriched by teachers knowing and exploring their own perspectives, their biases, and their cultural understanding.
It's a lot to think about. Thank you, Sandy, for bringing attention to the importance of this, taking the time to slow it down, help us remember to identify, understand our own biases so that we can move forward and help navigate some of those difficult conversations with other adults, but even more so with our own students. Know thyself, right? That's an
Yes.
old one, know thyself.
Yes.
And we get caught up in a lot of things and sometimes don't quite take the time. And know that certain people are going to approach things different. There are people who are very much want to be in control of their environments, and others are way more open. People are all over the place. We have extroverts, we have introverts, and they're all going to be mixed up in all of this, even in our classrooms as well. all right?
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for wrapping this up for us in part
My
4,
pleasure.
and all you did to help us create mindsets, skill sets to help us move forward with ethnic studies.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us for Module 2 of this 3-part series. Module 3 is going to further explore the topic as we think about California as our state, its past, its present, its future, and the different ethnic transformations that affect our world, shape our identity, and the ever-moving dynamics that are occurring right in our own classrooms. So I hope you join us too for Module 3 with Barb Doughton.